Hi, I'm business executive coach Svetlana Gaidukova, and I work with leaders, owners, and shareholders to help them to identify blind spots and work on them to grow. Welcome to my executive briefing series. Today we'll explore identity gaps, the invisible gap between who you think you are and how others perceive you. We'll cover that in 3 short parts. Firstly, we're going to look at identity gaps and how typical assessment tools show only part of the picture. Then we're going to move on and explore the framework of 3 personas: underlying, everyday, and overextended self. And in the third part, I will give you my own identity gap portrait with story how did I identify them, what helped me to work on them, and how did I improve my leadership. So let's start by discussing what is actually a gap, how we define that. In the business context, I'm sure that you have identified and managed a lot of gaps. On organizational level, this is the gap between desired performance and the current one. On team level, this can be the gap between capabilities, which you have or haven't in your team. On individual level, I bet this is performance and KPI you are going after, and maybe there is a gap, or maybe there is no gap. So these gaps are visible, we know how to manage them, we know how to trace them, and we know what to do about them. But then let's talk about the invisible gap, which appears between how you perceive you are and how others experience you. Just to give you a couple of examples to make it clear. So you may see yourself as super flexible leader, but your team may experience you as very chaotic. You may experience yourself as very sharp leader, but others may even experience you being a little bit insulting. So these invisible gaps are hard to spot, but they are really the one which are defining your performance. So let's discuss what are the tools usually used in assessment world or in the team management world to define these gaps and make them visible to you. So how do we spot the identity gaps? I'm sure many of us did a lot of assessments, received a lot of feedback, and also the development reports. But the real question is not whether this data is useful. The real question is, did this really had any impact on your leadership style and provide some insights, or was treated as yet another perspective of how you are viewed by others? Let me guide you through some examples together with assessment tools and what they show and what they don't show. So one client of mine came over with this report, and there he appeared to be, quite introverted, and he perceived that it is okay that he is silent in the meetings. However, his team claimed that he is distant and cold. So what report did, it showed the preference for reflection. However, what the feedback said, that the person is distant and cold. And there is a gap between these 2 perspectives people take. Another client of mine took a framework analysis by one of the Big 4, which really concluded that she lacks delegation skills. So what she did, as a very ambitious person, she took every single training out there on delegation skills. Yet, we are meeting 6 months down the road and there is no progress in that direction. So when we started to look what is driving this behavior is the conviction that if she will not check and read proof every single material her team creates, the work will simply be off. So we started to work with that conviction instead of mastering her delegation skills, which were, by the way, really solid. The last but not least, the 360, right? When you are giving the perspective through the eyes of others. So a CEO came and he was frustrated that the team sees him as super controlling and demanding. And the CEO actually reflected that, this team is not capable of doing anything without me. A loud statement, I must admit. So when we were working through his patterns, it appeared that the whole leadership style of him is driven by anxiety. And this anxiety didn't start yesterday. It started several years ago from a very, very costly mistake he did. So instead of choosing how to react and how to respond, he just went into this leadership style of overly controlling leader, which didn't do any good for him or for the team. So we know identity gaps by themselves are not dangerous. Assessment tools, unfortunately, show only part of the picture. So I really want to share how we can change that. So as we saw, the assessment tools are capturing only part of the story. And people are not partial, humans are not snapshots of report, context is evolving, so leadership and everything which happens around leader with teams, organizations, it's very dynamic. So what is the best way to capture these dynamics and how to work around it? I would like to introduce the framework which I rely on to do that. This is 3 personas framework, which characterize one person in 3 different contexts: the underlying, the everyday, and overextended self, and show how you appear across these 3 different contexts and 24 qualities. So we touched upon 3 personas: the underlying, everyday, and overextended. Now I would like to a little bit briefly discuss what each of these personas stand for and exemplify with the real cases to bring it to life. So let's start by the first one, by underlying self. The underlying self persona is the persona which is natural to you, and typically only the closest people who you know or who know you experience this part of your persona. To give you an example from the business context, the CEO I worked with came across as really good collaborator in underlying persona. So he genuinely cared about people, and collaborating with them. However, this is not how he was seen at work, because most people experienced very authoritarian CEO. Why? Because the business context demanded that and proved that this is the path to success. The second persona we see here on the slide is everyday self. So this is the persona everybody typically experiences around you, and this is how people know you, especially in the work settings. So this very same CEO, every day he appears as very, decisive and results-oriented, because this is the model how he got here, and this is what proved to be successful across his career. And then the third persona, which I finally and personally find the most thrilling one to explore, is overextended self. So this persona appears when the pressure is on and some strength can be overused or amplified. And we already looked into our dearest CEO. So when he is under stress, he becomes very tough and controlling. And what team experiences in this moment, and that this is just simple micromanagement, which doesn't allow them to come up with any good solution at all. So in this example, identity gaps between 3 personas became really visible. The person who is naturally very collaborating switches to decision and goal-oriented at work and becomes a super micromanager at work. So each of us has access to these 3 personas. The question is how to integrate them and how to balance them. And I would like to illustrate and share my private and personal story on identity gaps. How did I identify them and what I did to improve along different dimensions on leadership using this knowledge. Let me share my identity gaps. How did I uncover them and what I did about them to improve my leadership and how I showed up to others without changing who I am. So the first gap, as we see on the slide here, appears between radical and cautious. So inside, I'm super radical about business ideas. So usually I challenge the assumptions, the scenarios, to arrive at something very unusual. What others see is the result I deliver. The action plan, the strategy, the execution. So I was at most of the time seen as operational leader and not as a strategic visionary. So I changed that by explaining how I get to the results, by showing the scenarios, by discussing and involving others more. So then people around me started to see that actually I'm good at strategizing, and this is how I got my promotion to the desired level. The other thing appears, meaning the gap between the connector and independent leader. So internally, I feel very strong connection to people around me, but externally, I may appear as independent leader. Once I realized that people are just not guessing that I care about them, I have to tell them this, I started to interact with them more on one-on-ones during the debrief session, and good old chat and kitchens also helped. So this significantly improved the rapport and shortened the emotional distance between us. And then, as I mentioned, my favorite one, the overextended state, appears in between confidence and intensity under pressure. So whenever there is a crisis, the gap emerges between how internally I feel, and I feel very committed, I feel urged to perform, and responsible for the result, but what others may experience is incredible intensity. So now when the crisis mode is on, I typically take a moment to reflect what will get me team and organization further? Is it to put more pressure and to be high pacer, because this is sometimes always demanded in the critical situation with a very short time frame? Or do we have this capacity and time to give it a little bit of more breathing space to come up with a really nice idea? So now when I have these two modalities, I feel a little bit easier, and my team around me also. So this was a reflection on my identity gaps and how did I navigate them. So as we discussed today, the real question is not whether you have identity gaps or not, because every leader does, just trust me. The real question is whether you can see when your strengths have become limiting, or where how you appear to others is not in check with how you feel internally, and there is a big distance. So once you see something like that, it becomes manageable. But if you don't recognize this gap exists, then it becomes really hard for you to progress. So if today's session sparked curiosity, I invite you to complete your Lumina profile and book a session with me at gaidukova.com. I thank you for joining this executive briefing series, and I can't wait to welcome you to the new episode.